Son, you want 3 years? For a weed patch nobody would take for free? The courthouse laughed. Every seat, every row. Elijah Carter was 17, and all he owned were 9 goats his grandfather had left him when he died. Yes, sir, he said. 3 years, and not $1 of your money. And when you fail, then you'll have lost nothing, sir. You already can't sell it. 15 years, 140 acres choked under Kudzu. Not a single bid, not once. They gave him the 3 years because they were certain he would lose. 3 years later, under the last of the vines, he found 12 things his family had not spoken about in 60 years. What were they? Autumn came early to Fannin County that year, and the fog off Bell Creek reached the Carter cabin before the sun did. Elijah Carter was already awake. He had been awake since 4:30, the same as every morning since the funeral, because that was the hour his grandfather used to move around the kitchen, and the house still seemed to expect it. He pulled his boots out on the porch step so the noise would not carry, and walked down through the wet grass toward the pen. 9 goats lifted their heads when they heard him. They were boar stock, white-bodied with brown heads, and they had been the last thing Samuel Carter owned outright when he died the previous winter. Not the truck, which the bank took back. Not the little strip of bottom land he had leased for 20 years. Just the goats, a set of hand tools, and a way of saying things that Eli could not get out of his head. Land never owes anybody, his grandfather used to tell him. Only people owe the land. Samuel had said it so often that it stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather. It was only after he was gone that Eli began to hear it properly. There had been one other thing Samuel repeated, and that one the county remembered better because he had said it out loud in places where men in clean shirts could hear him. He believed goats could beat Kudzu. Not poison, not fire, not machines. Goats, and enough patience to let them do it slowly. He said it at the feed store. He said it once at a public meeting in 1999, and a man from the extension office smiled at him, with the particular kindness people show a child who has just explained the moon. Nobody listened. Samuel spent 40 years cutting other men's hay and never got the chance to prove it. Ruth Carter was 81 and had buried her husband in the coldest February in a decade. She got up an hour after her grandson, put the coffee on, and worked her garden rows until the heat pushed her back inside. The house ran on her pension check, the garden, and whatever Eli could earn on weekends. His parents had been gone for years, first to Atlanta for work and then farther, sending money when there was money to send, and calling on Sundays when the reception held. Ruth never spoke badly of them. She only said that some families get scattered, and the ones who stay behind have to hold the ground. Eli was 17 that fall, a senior at Fannin County High, and he was not the kind of boy teachers noticed. He did not raise his hand. He was not the fastest in the halls or the loudest at the lunch table. What he had, though the word for it never appeared on a report card, was attention. He noticed things, and then he kept noticing them long after anyone else would have stopped. That was how the whole thing started, if it can be said to have started anywhere. The fence line on the north side of Ruth's garden ran along a bank where Kudzu came over from the neighboring lot every summer. Ordinary people saw a nuisance. Eli watched the goats. Every morning turned loose, they went for the Kudzu first. Not the grass, not the browse along the creek. They stripped the vine leaves off the wire as though somebody were paying them by the pound. And only when the vine was bare did they wander back to anything else. He watched 3 summers of it. Not one of them ever sickened on it. Not one of them ever slowed down. He wrote it in the back of a composition notebook. Dates, weather, how far the vine had climbed back by the following week. Because writing it down was the only way he knew to argue with a grown person later. And there was, 11 miles up the Ridge Road, a place where that question mattered more than anywhere else in the state. 140 acres, taken by Fannin County for unpaid taxes 15 years earlier, and put up for auction more times than the clerk's office cared to count. Nobody had ever bid. The reason was visible from the road. Kudzu had come over the property line sometime in the 1990s and never stopped. It swallowed the fences first, then the equipment left standing in the field, then the barn, until the barn was only a shape under the green. It went up the trees and closed over the tops of them, so that from the ridge, the whole place looked like one solid, breathing thing. Every few years, somebody with money took a look. Every few years, the same estimate came back. Clearing it would cost more than the ground would ever be worth. People in town had a name for it. They called it the Dead 140, and they said it quickly, the name of a house where something bad had happened, and then moved on to something else. Eli passed it twice a day on the school bus. He had passed it his whole life, and for most of that life he had looked at it as everyone did. Which is to say, he had not really looked at it at all. But that fall, coming back from the pen with vine sap drying on his hands and his grandfather's sentence still turning over in his head, he started looking. And what he saw when he finally looked was not a dead place. It was a hungry one. And he already owned 9 animals that were hungrier. The last auction was held on a Tuesday morning in October in a room at the courthouse with folding chairs and a coffee urn that had not worked in years. Eli went because his grandmother had sent him to the tag office, and the meeting was in the same building, and because some part of him wanted to see who would finally take the place. The clerk read the parcel description. She read the minimum bid. She asked twice, as the law required, and then she wrote something short in her book and moved on to the next item. Nobody had raised a hand. Nobody had even shifted in a chair. It took less than 4 minutes to establish for the record that 140 acres of Fannin County were worth nothing at all. Then Dale Prescott stood up. Prescott had served on the Board of Commissioners for 11 years and had the tired, careful manner of a man who read budget documents on his own time. He was not cruel. He was responsible for a number at the bottom of a page, and the number had not been kind to him lately. He explained that the county could not carry the parcel any longer. Mowing contracts, liability, complaints from the 2 families still living on that road. So there was a plan, and he laid it out plainly. The county would bring in a contractor and spray the whole tract, fence to fence, with herbicide strong enough to knock the vine back to bare dirt. After that, with the ground cleared and legible again, the parcel would be sold at a discount to a company called Hollow Brook Development, which had already expressed interest in the ridge for a rock quarry and, in time, a fill site. It was, Prescott said, the only offer that had crossed that table in 15 years, and he intended to take it. Nobody in the room objected. Eli sat in the back and did the only arithmetic he was ever good at, which was not the kind they taught at school. He thought about water. Bell Creek came off that ridge. It ran the length of the Dead 140, went under the road at the low bridge, and came out the other side through the bottom of his grandmother's property, past the pump house, past the garden rows she had been working since before he was born. Whatever went on that hill went in that water. It was not a complicated idea. It was the first thing his grandfather had ever taught him about land, and it did not require a degree to follow. He said nothing that day. He picked up the tag renewal, walked out into the parking lot, and rode home. 3 days later, a letter came to the cabin. It was from the county, and it was about the Carter property itself, a delinquent notice for the current year's taxes, $194, with a date after which additional steps would be taken. Ruth read it at the kitchen table with her glasses pushed up on her forehead, and for a long while she did not say anything at all. Then she folded it in half, and in half again, and put it in the drawer where she kept things she intended to handle. "We'll pay it," she said. Eli asked her whether it was serious. His grandmother looked at the drawer instead of at him and told him that $194 had never once been serious to anybody who had it, and had never been anything but serious to people who did not. Then she got up and started supper, and that was the end of the conversation. Eli went out to the pen after dark. The goats came to the wire expecting something, as they always did. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked north toward the ridge, where the shape of the hill was just visible against a sky the color of wet slate. In 11 weeks, a contractor would put a spray rig on that hill, and in his back pocket was a composition notebook with 3 summers of dates in it, kept by a boy nobody had ever thought to ask a question of, proving something his grandfather had once said out loud in that same courthouse and been smiled at for. The public meeting on the spray contract was held on the 3rd Thursday in November at 7 in the evening in the same room. This time it was full. People came because of the road work at the other end of the agenda and because a spray contract that size meant a line item, and in a county that size, a line item was news. Eli came because he had not slept properly in 2 weeks. He had told his grandmother where he was going. Ruth looked at him over the top of her glasses for a long moment, then handed him his grandfather's good jacket, which was 2 sizes too big in the shoulders, and said only that he should stand up straight and speak like a person who had a right to be in the room. He sat through 40 minutes of other business with the notebook flat on his knee. When the chairman opened the floor for public comment on the Hollowbrook item, there was the particular quiet of a room where everyone has already agreed. Eli understood exactly what his 2 options were. He could sit still, which is what a 17-year-old is supposed to do in a room full of grown men, and go home and let the hill be sprayed and spend the rest of his life knowing he had been in the building. Or he could stand up and ask a room that had never once asked his family for anything to give him something no reasonable person would give him. He stood up. He gave his name. He said he lived on Bell Creek below the parcel. He said he had 9 Boer goats and 3 summers of written records, and that he could bring the vine down on that ground without a single gallon of chemical going into the water his grandmother drank. Then he asked for 3 years. Someone in the second row laughed before he finished the sentence. And once one person laughs in a room like that, the rest is permission. It was not vicious laughter. That was almost the worst part of it. It was the warm, indulgent noise people make at something small and brave and doomed. Prescott did not laugh. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and asked his question slowly, without any malice in it. "Son, I've got an offer on that table tonight and a hole in next year's budget," he said. "What am I supposed to write in the minutes? That I turned down money for a boy and some goats?" Eli answered that the county had been carrying that parcel for 15 years and had never once been offered anything that did not start with a spray rig. Then he told them why the spray rig had never worked. He said Kudzu keeps its strength underground, in the crown and the root, and that cutting it or burning it or spraying the top of it only takes the leaves. He said a leaf is how a plant eats. Take the leaves enough times over enough seasons, and the root spends what it has and never gets it back. He said his goats would not finish it in a summer. He said that was the entire point. The room was not laughing anymore. It was not persuaded either. It was simply, for the first time that evening, listening. The board went back and forth for 20 minutes. The county attorney said what county attorneys say: insurance, liability, the difficulty of a minor as a party to an agreement. Ruth's name went on the paperwork in the end, with her grandson named as the operator. And then the chairman read the terms out loud so they would sit in the minutes. And Eli listened to his own life being set down in 3 sentences. He would have 3 years, not 1 season more. He would receive no county money, no equipment, no fuel, no fencing, and no labor. And at the end of the 3rd year, the county would send its own people to assess the ground. If they found nothing they could point to and call restoration, he would lose all use of the parcel. The county would sell it immediately, and there would be no second meeting in which to argue. The chairman asked whether he understood. Eli said that he did. He signed nothing that night. The papers came later in an envelope, and Ruth read every line of them twice before she put her name at the bottom. But the thing itself was done in that room, in front of people who would remember it. And that was what he had not fully understood while he was standing. He had not only asked for 3 years of ground, he had put his grandfather's name and his grandmother's, and the name of a family that had never owned much besides the name, out on a table in front of the entire county. and he had done it in a building where a carter had once been smiled at and sent home. Walking out to the truck in the cold, he did not feel brave. He felt the way a person feels standing at the side of a road, watching the bus pull away. There was no way back to before. Winter bought him nothing but time to get ready, and he used all of it. Kudzu sleeps from the first hard frost until the ground warms, which meant that for the first 4 months of his 3 years, the hill did exactly nothing while Eli worked every daylight hour he had outside of school. He walked the boundary until he knew where the old fence lines were buried. He borrowed a mattock and cut a path up the worst of the slope so the herd could be moved without losing an animal in the tangle. Everything he built out of what people threw away. Step-in posts from a farm sale, a spool of polywire a neighbor had given up on, a solar charger with a cracked case that worked if you kept the panel clean. His grandmother watched him carry it all up the ridge in the bed of a borrowed truck and did not tell him it was too little. She only asked each evening whether he had eaten. The vine woke in the second week of April, and it woke fast. He had read that Kudzu could put on a foot a day in high summer. Reading it and standing in front of it were two different experiences. He would set a paddock on a Sunday, move the herd through it by Wednesday, and by the following Sunday, the runners were already back across ground he had watched them strip bare. 9 goats, 140 acres. He did that arithmetic once, honestly, sitting on a rock with the notebook open on his knee, and then he closed the notebook and never did it again. The number was not survivable if you looked at it all at once, so he stopped looking at it all at once. 5 acres, that was the whole world. 5 acres, and then the next 5. The fence came down twice in 1 week in May. The first time it was his own fault. A post set too shallow in ground that turned out to be more vine than soil. The second time, a storm rolled the wire flat, and he spent the whole of a Saturday walking the ridge calling, until he found the last 4 animals 2 ridges over, standing in somebody's hayfield looking pleased with themselves. In June, a pair of loose dogs came through the paddock at dusk and scattered the herd into the brush. Nothing was killed. One of the young does tore her leg on old barbed wire nobody had known was there, buried under 30 years of green, and Eli sat with her in the dark with a flashlight in his teeth, cleaning the wound as his grandfather had shown him on the kitchen table one winter when he was 11. He found more of that wire over the next month. The hill was full of things people had abandoned and then forgotten they had abandoned. Then 3 of the goats went off their feed. He knew what it was before the extension pamphlet confirmed it. Parasites. The ordinary curse of animals grazing hard ground in a wet season. What he did not have was the $40-some for the medicine, and the 2 weeks it took him to earn it hauling firewood on weekends were the longest 2 weeks of his life to that point. All 3 came through. He wrote the dates in the notebook. He also wrote in the margin, in handwriting that was not as steady as the rest, "They don't get sick from the kudzu. They get sick from me not knowing enough yet." School did not stop happening while this went on. He was falling asleep in 4th period by the end of the spring semester, and his grades, which had never been remarkable, slid from unremarkable into something a guidance counselor wanted to talk about. He graduated that May by a margin nobody in the family mentioned out loud, walked across the gymnasium floor in a borrowed gown, and was back on the ridge the following morning at 4:30. At school, he had a name by then, the Goat Boy, and it followed him into town after graduation, said the same way the laughter in the courthouse had been said. Not cruelly, easily, by people who would forget it by lunch. Eli let it sit. He had learned early that you cannot argue a nickname away. You can only outlast it. In August, a letter went around to the 2 families still living on the Ridge Road, and from there to the courthouse. It asked the board to end the arrangement early. It cited animals loose on the state road in May and the possibility of a collision, and the county's exposure if one happened. Dale Prescott read it into the minutes and made no recommendation. That was, in its way, the most frightening thing that had happened all year. He did not need to recommend anything. The 3-year clock was doing the work for him. By the end of that first summer, standing on the ridge, Eli could not have shown a stranger a single thing that looked like progress. He could see it. He knew where the vine had thinned, where the leaf cover had gone from solid to broken, where a little native grass had come up in a strip about the size of a porch. But from the road, and the road was where everybody looked from, the dead 140 looked exactly as it had for 15 years. It was in September that Earl Whitmore stopped. He was 63, ran cattle on the far side of the ridge, and had a white beard and hands that had been repairing fence since before Eli's mother was born. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder, cut the engine, and stood at the wire for a long while without saying anything at all. When he finally spoke, it was one sentence, and he did not soften it. "I've watched 3 owners lose to that ground," Earl said. "They burned it, they sprayed it, they bulldozed it. The kudzu always comes back." Then he got in his truck and drove away. He did not offer to help. Not yet. The change, when it came, did not come from the hill. It came from Earl Whitmore, and it came in the second week of November, almost exactly 1 year after the meeting. Eli had spent that entire first year working the same 5 acres nearest the road, on the theory that if he was going to have anything to show anyone, it should be the part they could see without getting out of the truck. He had moved the herd through that block 11 separate times. By the 11th pass, the vine was not coming back as it had. The leaves came back thin. The runners came back short. In 2 or 3 places along the upper edge, they did not come back at all. And there was bare, sunlit dirt where nothing but green had been for 2 decades. Earl stopped again on a Thursday. This time he climbed the bank. He walked the 5 acres with his hands in his jacket pockets, taking his time, a man covering ground he intended to have an opinion about. He towed at the bare dirt. He pulled a runner up and looked at where it came from. He looked at the crowns, at the woody knots at the base of the vine, and at how much smaller the new growth was than the old. He did not say anything to Eli at all that afternoon. He called Ruth Carter at 7 o'clock the next morning. She took the call standing at the kitchen counter, and when she hung up, she stood there with her hand still on the phone for a while before she turned around. "Earl Whitmore wants to rent your goats," she said. Eli asked her whether he was serious. His grandmother told him that Earl Whitmore had never made a joke in his life that anybody had been able to identify, that he had offered money, and that a man who offers money is always serious. Earl had 40 acres of creek bottom on his own place that had been going under vine for 6 years. He had sprayed it twice and mowed what he could reach and lost ground both times. He was not a man who believed in new ideas, and he said so plainly when Eli came to look at the field. What he believed in was what he had seen with his own eyes on that ridge, which was the first thing in 6 years that had made Kudzu look tired. Eli walked the bottomland with him and then said the thing that mattered more than anything else he said that year. "My goats eat a lot," he told Earl, "but they don't work miracles. They just never quit." Earl Whitmore looked at him for a moment and said that was the first honest sentence anybody had said to him about that field. That was the flip. For 1 year, the herd had been the thing that cost money. Feed in the lean months, medicine, wire, fuel. From that November forward, the herd was the thing that made money. Not much of it. Enough. Earl told Benjamin Reeves, who ran nearly 300 acres up near the Tennessee line and had lost pasture to invasive growth through 3 wet seasons in a row. Reeves was 58, quiet, and deeply suspicious of anything that sounded like an agricultural trend. He hired the herd for 6 weeks that spring, and when Eli came to collect the animals, Reeves walked the fence line with him and said the only thing he ever said on the subject. "I don't know that I believe in this," he told him, "but I know what my own eyes did all June," and they didn't argue. Then he told a man in Union County, and that man told his brother-in-law. Eli started keeping 2 notebooks, one for the hill, one for the contracts, acreage, dates, what the ground looked like before and after, signed at the bottom each time by the landowner. He did not know yet why he was collecting signatures. It only seemed like the kind of thing his grandfather would have wanted written down. 9 goats became 27 by the end of that second summer, partly by births and partly because 2 of his customers paid him in young stock instead of cash, which suited him better anyway. In July, he opened a bank account. The lease on the parcel was in his grandmother's name, so the account went in hers as well, with his beneath it, and she signed with the fountain pen she kept in the drawer with the folded letter from the county, the one she had said they would pay, and had paid. Walking out of the bank, Ruth told him that his grandfather had never once had a checking account. He asked her why not. "Because nobody ever offered him one," she said. The second thing happened in April of the 3rd spring on the worst slope on the property. It was a north-facing pitch on the backside of the hill, steep enough that he had needed to cut the path just to get animals onto it, and he had been working the herd across it in rotation for 2 full growing seasons. It was the ground he had been most certain he would lose. That morning he climbed it with pruning shears and the notebook and stopped about halfway up. The vine had let go. Not all of it, but the canopy had broken open, and the dead runners lay over the ground in gray ropes, and where light was reaching soil for the first time in 20 years, there were wildflowers he did not know the names of. And standing in an uneven line across the slope were trees. He had known there were trees under there. Every acre had trees under it. But these were not the thin, volunteer stuff that comes up in abandoned ground. These had trunks a man could not reach around, with bark cut into deep furrows by age, and dead limbs sticking out at the wrong angles from years of fighting for light they never got. And on the lower branches, on almost every one of them, there were new green leaves. He counted them. He walked the line and counted again to be sure. 12. 12 mature pecan trees, half strangled, ugly, alive. He put ribbon on every one of them that afternoon and drew them onto the hand map in the back of the notebook. He did not tell anyone. He was not being secretive about it. He simply did not know what it meant, and he had learned by then not to say things out loud until he knew what they meant. It took him 4 days to bring his grandmother up the hill. She was 84 by then, and the climb was not easy, and he went slowly and stopped when she stopped. When they came around the shoulder of the slope and the line of trunks came into view, Ruth Carter stopped walking altogether. She stood there so long that Eli finally asked her if she was all right. His grandmother did not answer that question. She answered a different one he had not known enough to ask. "That was Isaiah's orchard," she said. Isaiah Carter was Eli's great-grandfather. He had planted pecans on that hill in 1948 and worked them for 13 years, and in 1961 the land was sold out from under him at a tax sale over a bill of less than $200. A sale nobody in the family was notified of until it was finished. Ruth had been 21 that year, newly married into the family. She had known the whole time. Eli asked her why nobody had ever said anything. He asked her whether his grandfather had known. Ruth told him that his grandfather had known every day of his life, that Samuel had been a young man of 23 when it happened, and had watched his father go quiet and stay quiet, and had spent the next 40 years talking about that hill to anybody who would stand still for it. But never once about whose hill it had been. He said if he told them the name, she said, they'd hear a grudge. And a grudge is easy to walk away from. He wanted them to hear a way of doing it. He thought that might last longer. Then she looked at the trees. It hurt to say, and hurting never once brought it back. Eli stood on his great-grandfather's hill with his hands full of survey ribbon and understood that everything he had believed he was doing for 3 years had been wrong. He had not been clearing a weed patch. He had been walking home. Knowing whose hill it was did not add a single hour to the day. That was the cruelty of the last stretch, and Eli felt it every week. The contracts that had saved him were now the thing eating him alive. He had 8 paying customers spread across 3 counties, and the work was real work, hauling, setting fence on unfamiliar ground, checking animals twice a day on land 40 minutes from his own bed. Every hour the herd spent earning money on somebody else's kudzu was an hour it did not spend on the ridge. He was running the operation that was supposed to save the hill by keeping the herd off the hill. He tried to split them. 27 animals divided into 2 working groups is not 2 herds. It is 2 groups too small to do anything to a mature stand of vine. He tried it for a month, watched the back slope start coming back on him, and put them together again. The clock kept running. 7 months, then 4. Ruth found him asleep at the kitchen table one evening in September with a fencing plan under his cheek and his supper untouched beside it. And she waited until the next morning to say what she had to say. He had lost weight that summer. He was not sleeping more than 5 hours in any night, and there were days he did not eat until dark. The porch step at the cabin had been broken since June, and neither of them had mentioned it, because mentioning it meant admitting there was no one left with time to fix it. "Your grandfather left you those goats," she told him. "He didn't leave you to me in pieces." He argued with her, which he almost never did. He told her the clock did not care whether he slept. She let him finish and then said she had spent 60 years watching men in that family trade their whole selves for one good season, that she had buried one of them in February, and that she was not going to sit in this kitchen and watch it happen twice. He started coming in for supper after that. It cost him hours he did not have. The other thing happened on a Tuesday morning in October before 6. He was walking the herd up the ridge road toward the gate, as he had 1,000 times, when a sheriff's deputy pulled up behind him with the light bar turning and asked him what he was doing up there. Eli stopped the animals. He gave his name. He said he had a written agreement with the county for the parcel. And then he took the letter out of his wallet, where it had lived for almost 3 years, folded and refolded until the creases had gone furry. The deputy read it under the dome light. He was not unkind about it. He handed it back, said he had not been aware of the arrangement, told him to have a good morning, and drove on. The whole thing took 4 minutes. That afternoon, Eli went to the library in Blue Ridge and made 3 photocopies of the letter. He put one in the truck, one in the tack box, and one in his wallet, and kept the original in the drawer at home with his grandmother's papers. He never mentioned it to Ruth. He simply carried copies from then on, as a person carries an umbrella after one's soaking. And he did not need it explained to him why. And while all of that was happening, something was happening down in the courthouse that he did not learn about until much later. The hill had started to look different from the road. That was the whole trouble. For 2 years the parcel had been the dead 140, and nobody had wanted it at any price. Now a man driving the ridge road could see grass on the lower blocks and open sky where the canopy had closed over, and the shape of the old barn standing up out of the green again. Hollowbrook Development came back. Their first offer, 3 years earlier, had been a salvage price for a liability. The new one was not. Cleared ground with road frontage and a rock ridge under it was worth considerably more than choked ground that would have to be sprayed before anyone could survey it, and the company had done that arithmetic before the board had. The number they put on the table that fall was more than double what they had offered when Prescott first stood up in that room. Dale Prescott was not a wicked man and had never pretended to be a sentimental one. He read budget documents on his own time. He looked at a figure that would cover the ambulance shortfall and 2 miles of paving on the north end of the county, and he set it next to an arrangement with a 20-year-old that produced no revenue at all and had an open complaint from the Ridge Road families sitting in the file. He did not decide anything that autumn. He started recalculating, which is a slower and more dangerous thing. Word of it reached Eli sideways at the feed store from a man who assumed he already knew. He drove home the long way up over the ridge and stopped at the gate in the dark with the engine running. He had spent 3 years being laughed at for trying to make 140 acres worth something. He had succeeded. That was the part he had not seen coming. He had made it worth something, and the moment it was worth something, it stopped being the kind of place they would leave in the hands of a carter. He had 4 weeks left before the final assessment, 12 trees on the back slope that nobody in the county knew existed, and no idea at all that the worst of it had not started yet. The storm came through on the last Saturday in September, 6 weeks before the end of the third year. It was not a hurricane, and nobody called it a disaster. It was the ordinary kind of violent weather that comes up the Blue Ridge in the fall. 4 hours of straight-line wind and rain, heavy enough to turn the ridge road into a creek, and it took down power to half the county and pine limbs across every road on the north end. It also took down 11 separate runs of portable electric fence on 140 acres. Eli got up there at first light with a headlamp and a coil of wire and found the paddocks open and empty, the poly line snarled through the brush, and the solar charger face down in 6 inches of standing water. The herd was gone across 3 properties. He spent 2 days walking. Earl Whitmore drove the roads for him. Benjamin Reeves sent his son-in-law over with a stock trailer and a bucket of feed, and by Monday evening, they had accounted for 39 of the 41 animals. The last 2 were never found. He walked the creek line for them for a week afterward, mornings and evenings, calling into ground so thick a man could pass within 10 feet of an animal and never know. He never learned what became of them. In some ways, that was worse than knowing, and he did not talk about it to anybody. The citation came Thursday. Livestock at large on a state right-of-way. There was a fine attached to it, and there was a second page that mattered far more than the first, because it directed that the herd be held and not returned to the parcel pending review of the arrangement. They did not take the animals off his property. They simply forbade him to work them on the county's. 39 goats stood in a borrowed lot on Earl Whitmore's place, eating hay Eli was paying for, 11 miles from the only ground in the world that needed them. The vine did not wait. That is the thing about kudzu that nobody outside understands. It is not a plant that holds still while you sort out your paperwork. Within 12 days, there were runners back across the lower block he had cleaned 3 times that summer, and within 3 weeks, the bare, sunlit dirt he had been so proud of in November had a green haze over it again. He stood at the wire and watched 2 years of work start to close over, and he was not permitted to open the gate. The board met in a special called session on the 2nd Tuesday in October. The item on the agenda was written in the language such things are always written in. Review of the parcel arrangement in light of the incident of September 28th and the county's continuing exposure. Eli was there in his grandfather's jacket. It fit him now. He listened to the county attorney describe an animal-at-large event on a state highway and a claim that had not been filed but might yet be. He listened to a man from the Ridge Road say he had warned them about this 3 years ago. Neither of them said anything untrue. Nobody mentioned that the fence had come down in a storm that also took the roof off a church shed in Morganton. Nobody had to. The storm was not the reason. The storm was the door, and the offer on the table was what came through it. Dale Prescott spoke last and briefly. He said the county had made an unusual accommodation in good faith, that the accommodation had produced a public safety incident, and that in his judgment, the responsible course was to terminate early and accept the standing offer from Hollowbrook Development. The vote was 4-1. The sale was to close in 45 days. Eli walked out of that room and did not remember driving home. It was somewhere on the Ridge Road in the dark that he understood exactly what they had taken. Not 6 weeks. The 3 years had been nearly up anyway. What the vote had taken from him was the assessment, the one day in his life when the county was contractually obligated to walk that ground, look at it, and write down what was actually there. He had built everything toward that morning. Every rotation, every paddock, every night on the hill had been aimed at putting one honest man on that slope with a clipboard. They had canceled the only test he had ever been promised and replaced it with a storm. Ruth fell in the kitchen that Friday night. He heard it from the porch, not a crash, just a sound that was wrong, and found her on the floor between the table and the stove, conscious, apologizing, trying to get up on an arm that would not hold her. She had broken her hip. She was 84 years old. She had walked up that ridge in April to look at her father-in-law's trees, and now she could not stand up in her own kitchen. He rode with her to the hospital in Blue Ridge and sat in the corridor outside her room for most of the night. At some point, a nurse brought him coffee he did not drink. At some point, the sky outside the window at the end of the hall went from black to gray. He had the termination notice folded in his jacket pocket. He had carried it since Tuesday without meaning to, as he had once carried the other letter. 3 years, and it came out to this. No herd on the hill, no agreement, no assessment, no money to speak of, no lawyer, no time, and the only person left in the world who knew what those 12 trees were, lying in a room 40 feet away with a pin in her hip. 60 years his family had not talked about that hill. He had gotten close enough to touch it, and he had nothing left to hold it with. The sale was set to close in 45 days, and Eli spent the first 2 of them doing nothing at all. He sat in the corridor at the hospital, and then in the chair beside his grandmother's bed, and then in the truck in the parking lot at 4 in the morning, because the truck was the only place nobody could see him. 3 years of getting up before light had left him with a body that woke on its own, whether there was any reason to or not. He called his mother on the second night from the payphone by the vending machines. She cried and asked the questions people ask from 600 miles away, and said she would try to come at Thanksgiving if the shifts allowed. Ruth had told him not to worry them, and he had done it anyway, and afterward he was not sure which of them he had made the call for. On the 3rd morning, Earl Whitmore came and found him in the parking lot. Earl did not offer condolences, and he did not ask how Ruth was doing, because he had already stopped at the nurse's station and found out. What he said was that the herd could not stay in his lot eating purchased hay for another month, and that if the boy meant to lose this thing, he ought to at least lose it with his animals on the ground where they belonged. Then he said the other part, that he had spoken to Benjamin Reeves, and Reeves had spoken to 4 more, and there were men willing to put their names on paper for the fence. That was the beginning of it. The county's order had held the herd off the parcel because of the county's exposure. Exposure is a word that means somebody will have to pay if it happens again, and it turns out that if enough people are willing to say in writing that they will be the ones to pay, the word loses most of its power. 9 landowners signed the indemnity. Earl Whitmore's name was first because he was the one who drove it around. The county attorney reviewed it, found it sound, and released the animals back onto the parcel 11 days after the storm. They rebuilt the fence in a single weekend. There were 17 people on that hill that Saturday, most of whom Eli had worked for, and 2 of whom he had never met. They came with post drivers and wire and their own trucks. They set the corner braces properly this time, in real ground below the vine, and they ran the line where Earl said to run it instead of where the terrain made it easy. The men who came were not there because a story had moved them. Every one of them had watched those animals work 40 or 60 or 100 acres of their own land and had seen what came of it. They came because they had already been paid back once and thought the arithmetic was fair. By Monday, the herd was back on the lower blocks, working the runners that had come in during the 4 weeks of standing still. That saved the ground. It did not save anything else. The vote had been taken. The offer had been accepted. 6 weeks is not a season, and no amount of grazing was going to change what the parcel looked like by the middle of November. Which meant the second thing he had to do that month was the thing he had never done before, and had no idea how to do, and had exactly one advantage in. He had a hill full of evidence, and nobody in the county knew it was there. He called the University of Georgia Extension office on a Tuesday and asked whether anyone could come look at 12 old pecan trees on reclaimed ground. Andrew Mercer drove up from the south end of the district that Friday in a white pickup with soil probes rattling in the bed. He was 49, lean, gray coming in at the temples, and he had spent more than 20 years walking other people's orchards, because his own family's peach operation had gone under when he was young, for want of advice that arrived 2 seasons too late. He had built an entire career on the principle that you tell a landowner what he has while he still has it. He spent a full day on that hill. He measured trunk diameters. He looked at the new wood and at the scaffolding limbs and at the dead ones. He dug 4 shallow inspection pits on different aspects of the slope and pulled samples from each. And he walked the lower blocks where the vine had been off the ground longest. And he wrote in a field notebook without saying much of anything. Late in the afternoon, the two of them stood under the largest of the 12, looking down the valley. Mercer closed the notebook. "You don't have 12 miracle trees," he said. "You have 12 survivors." Eli asked him what that was worth. The older man told him that the trees themselves were worth almost nothing, that they were exhausted, that they would give a crop but never a commercial one, and that any honest man would tell him so. Then he handed over the first of the soil results and said the part that mattered. The value was underneath. Nobody had put a plow in that hill since 1961. Nobody had compacted it. Nobody had stripped it. Nobody had run it into the ground with row crops for 60 years. And for the last 20 of those years, the vine canopy, of all things, had held the topsoil down through every storm that came over the ridge. What was left underneath was deep, well-drained, and balanced in a way Mercer said he saw perhaps twice a year. It was, in his professional judgment, ground capable of carrying a commercial pecan orchard, and there was not much like it left in that part of Georgia. Eli asked him whether he would put that in writing. Mercer said he would put it on letterhead and sign it, because that was the entire reason he had taken the job in the first place. The third thing took 3 afternoons in the basement of the courthouse. The records room in Fannin County is not organized for a person in a hurry. It is organized for lawyers, and it assumes you already know the year. Eli knew the year. He found the deed book on the second afternoon. Isaiah Carter. 140 acres on the ridge above Bell Creek, recorded in 1948. On the third afternoon, he found the other entry, in a different hand, in a different book. A tax sale in 1961, over an amount that came to $183, with a purchaser's name and a date, and no indication anywhere in the file that the family had been sent notice of anything. He photocopied every page twice. The night before the meeting, he sat in the truck outside the hospital with all of it in a folder on the seat beside him, and came very close to not going. Not out of fear, exactly. Out of the flat certainty that had been building for 6 weeks. That the room had already decided. That it had decided 3 years ago. And that a folder was not going to reverse a 4-to-1 vote for a young man who was barely 20 and had already cost the county a citation and a claim they were waiting on. He went up to his grandmother's room at 8 o'clock and told her he did not think he could do it. Ruth Carter had been in that bed for nearly a month. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she took a while before she answered. "Your great-grandfather didn't lose that land because he was wrong," she said. "He lost it because there was nobody who had to listen to him. Your grandfather spent 40 years talking and never once got a room." Then she looked at her grandson. "You've got a whole room that has to sit there and listen. Don't you dare give it back." The meeting was held on the second Thursday in November, 13 days before the sale was to close. The room was full again, as it had been 3 years earlier, and for some of the people in it, this was the second time they had come to watch a Carter stand up in that building. Eli did not ask them for anything. That was the decision he had made in the truck, and he held to it. He had spent a month expecting to walk in and plead, and somewhere between the records room and his grandmother's hospital bed, he had understood that pleading was what they were prepared for. A boy asking a favor is a story with an ending everybody already knows. So he did not tell them about his grandfather. He did not tell them about the hip or the corridor or the 2 animals that were never found. He presented a file. He started with Andrew Mercer's letter on university letterhead, and he read the operative paragraph out loud. That the soil on the parcel was deep, well-drained, mineral-balanced, and preserved by 60 years without cultivation, and that it was capable of supporting commercial pecan production under proper management. He said the extension office would confirm it to anyone who cared to call. Then he put up the cost comparison, and this was the part he had built the way his grandfather would have built a fence. Slowly, and out of what was already lying there. On one side, the county's own plan, the herbicide contract as bid 3 years earlier. Then the thing nobody had priced because nobody had asked. Bell Creek came off that ridge, ran the length of the tract, and went under the road into the watershed that served the 2 families on the Ridge Road, and further down, a public intake. Once that fact was in the record, and he had just put it in the record, anything that disturbed that slope at scale would have to clear a water quality assessment first. Not only the spray. A rock quarry. A fill site. Any of it. The assessment was not cheap. It was not fast. And it had never appeared on the sheet the board had voted from. On the other side, 3 years of his own contract record, acreage, dates, and signatures. The notebook he had started keeping because it seemed like the kind of thing Samuel Carter would have wanted written down. 9 landowners, just over 400 acres of grazing management across 3 counties. Not $1 of public money in any of it. He said the model was not a favor anyone had done him. He said it had paid for itself for 2 years and could be shown to do so. Then he laid the hand-drawn map on the table with the 12 trees marked on it in red. And last, because he had decided it should be last, he put down the 2 photocopies from the basement of that same building. 1948, 1961. $183. He did not editorialize on them. He said only that the board should know the history of the parcel it was selling, because it was in their own records and they had a right to it. The room stayed very quiet through all of it. Hollowbrook Development had sent a representative, and it was the water that moved him. He asked 2 questions about the assessment requirement, wrote something down, and asked for the meeting to be recessed for 10 minutes. When it resumed, he stated that his company was withdrawing its offer pending further review, which is how such things are said when what has actually happened is that a figure has appeared that nobody put in the model. They never came back. Dale Prescott spoke after that, and he did not apologize. And Eli respected him more for it afterward than he would have if he had. He said he had voted in October on the information in front of him, that the information in front of him had been incomplete, and that the responsibility for that belonged to the board and not to the young man at the podium. He said the county did not have the money to develop the parcel itself and never would. Then he made the motion. A 20-year lease of the 140 acres to Ruth Carter and Elijah Carter, with an option to purchase at appraised value at any time during the term at a rate the county could defend in the minutes. And a condition, which Prescott wrote himself and read aloud twice. The lease would remain in force only so long as the restoration continued. Annual assessment. Documented reduction in invasive cover. If the ground went backward, the county took it back. It was not generosity. It was the most practical thing in the room from the most practical man in it. And it was the reason the arrangement survived every board that came after him. The vote was 5-0. Ruth Carter signed the lease from a chair in the rehabilitation wing 8 days later with the same fountain pen, and told her grandson to read every line before he put his own name under hers. The story ran in the regional paper the following spring, which was how Rebecca Lawson came to call. She was 42 and ran a nursery up the highway that her parents had left her, specializing in fruit and nut stock. And she had rebuilt that business once from almost nothing after an ice storm took out several thousand young trees in a single night. She had never afterward promised anybody a fast result. She drove down and walked a property with him, and what she looked at longest was not the 12 trees. It was the spacing on the rows he had staked out for the first planting. She asked him why he was going so slow. He told her he could only plant what the goats had actually taken back, and that the hill would decide the pace, not him. Rebecca Lawson told him he was not planting slow. "You're planting smart," she said. From that season on, she set aside her strongest grafted stock for him every year, and she never once tried to sell him more than he had ground for. The first planting went in that April. 160 grafted trees, on the lower blocks where the vine had been off the longest, with drainage cut, tubes on every trunk, and irrigation run before a single tree came out of the truck. A man slowed on the ridge road and called out to ask if that was all of them. Eli said that it was and went back to work. He had learned by then that patience looks exactly like failure to people who only measure speed. The herd paid for everything. That did not change for 11 years. Every grazing contract, every young animal sold to a farm starting its own vegetation program went into fencing and tube and pipe and stock. The second summer, a drought took nearly a fifth of the young trees. A late frost the following April took the tender growth off most of the rest. He replanted and wrote the losses in the notebook and did not complain about it, because by then he understood that farming rewards consistency and has never once rewarded perfection. The 12 old trees were never touched except to be pruned and treated. He called them the teachers. By then, the word had two meanings, and only two people alive knew both of them. 22 years later, the hills above Bell Creek were rose. They ran along the contour of the slope the way Rebecca Lawson had shown him to lay them out that first spring. 120 acres of mature pecan across ground that had once been a single unbroken sheet of green, with wide grass lanes between every row so a truck could get through in October and so the light could get down to the soil in July. The wildflowers had never left after that first opening. Bees worked them from April on. Songbirds nested in the orchard in numbers that a man from the state came out twice to count. And the ground held water now. It took a hard rain and kept it, instead of sending it down the hill into the creek. Which was the thing Andrew Mercer had told him would happen, and the thing that took the longest to believe. Elijah Carter was past 40. His hands had gone the way his grandfather's had gone, and he still got up at 4:30. Because at that point, it was no longer a decision. In the 11th year, he had exercised the option and bought the parcel outright at appraised value, using 9 seasons of pecan income and every dollar the herd had ever earned him. The deed hung in the office at the back of the packing house, in a plain frame, beside a photocopy of another deed recorded in 1948. Visitors sometimes asked why a man would frame a photocopy. He never gave the same answer twice, and none of the answers were long. The processing building sat at the bottom of the property, cleaning and drying and cracking and packing under one plain metal roof. Nothing in it was impressive. He had bought every piece of it for reliability rather than appearance, from people who could service it, which was the same philosophy that had gotten 9 goats up a ridge road in the first place. Beside it stood the market, with a wide wooden porch that looked back up the slope. Families came from 3 states in the fall for fresh pecans, and for pies and honey and jam and soap, and better than half of what sat on those shelves had been made by somebody else. He had invited the neighboring farms in the first year the market opened, and had never once reconsidered it. He did not believe that success got smaller when it was shared. He had watched 9 men put their names on a piece of paper for him when he had nothing, and he had never gotten over it. A few dozen goats still worked the steep edges of the property, the field lines and the fence rows and the back of the ridge where machinery would not go. They were not the business anymore. They had not been the business in a very long time. But every hire who came to work that orchard was walked out to see them in the first week, and nobody who worked there was permitted to forget what they were. The sign at the gate had been repainted 3 times and said the same thing every time. Carter Pecan Orchard, established 1948. Restored. Visitors sometimes asked about the date because it did not match the story they had heard. That was the point of it. A young reporter named Emily Foster came out one afternoon in October to write a piece for a regional agricultural magazine. She was 28, had grown up on a small dairy at the other end of the state, and had gone into journalism because she had watched her own family's place get sold and written up in exactly 1 paragraph in the back of a newspaper. She was not looking for a miracle story. She said so, which is probably why he talked to her. They walked up the hill to the 12. They stood at the center of the orchard now, on the north slope, in a block of their own that had never been planted around and never would be. They were old past any usefulness. 2 of them were mostly dead wood held up out of habit. They still made pecans in small, ugly quantities, and every one of those pecans went into a bin that was not for sale. Emily Foster asked him the question people always asked, which was when he had known he had won. She expected him to say the night of the vote. Elijah Carter looked at the 12 trunks for a while before he answered her. It wasn't the vote, he said. It wasn't the first harvest. And it wasn't the year the orchard finally paid for itself. And it wasn't the day people stopped laughing, because I'll tell you the truth, I don't remember that day happening. He said the rest of it slowly. It was the afternoon I understood I wasn't taking a piece of land back from anybody. I was giving it back what it had already given my family, 60 years before I got here. Ruth Carter lived 6 more years after that lease was signed. Long enough to sit on the porch of the market on opening day and to be told by more than one stranger that she must be very proud. She always answered the same way, that she was proud of the boy, but that the boy had gotten it from somewhere. The 12 were never kept because they produced. They were kept because a person who walks up that hill and stands under them understands something in about 4 seconds that would take an hour to explain. That a thing can be buried, written off, priced at nothing, sold out from under the people who planted it, and covered over for 2 decades, and still be alive underneath, waiting for somebody patient enough to take the weight off. Every employee, every visitor, every family brought up that hill in October hears their story before they hear anything else about the farm. That was the arrangement. It always was. Before you go, take this with you. Sometimes God does not move the hill overnight. Sometimes he sends a young man with 9 goats and enough patience to move it 1 acre at a time. And then he lets that young man be laughed at for 3 years, so that when the ground finally turns green, nobody can say it was luck. Everyone in that county looked at those 140 acres and saw a dead place. A boy who had inherited almost nothing looked at the same ground and saw something worth 3 years of his life, before there was a single thing standing there to prove him right. That is what faith actually looks like. Not certainty, not a sign in the sky, just getting up at 4:30 in the morning for 1,000 mornings and doing the next small thing, when nothing in front of you has changed yet. Maybe you are in a season like that right now. Maybe your prayers have been going up for years, and the ground still looks exactly as it did when you started. Maybe you are tired of being the only one who believes the thing you believe. Remember what was under that vine. 12 trees still standing, soil that had been protected the whole time by the very thing that looked like ruin. 60 years of silence, and the roots never once let go. God is working underneath long before you can see the first green leaf. Never underestimate what he can grow out of a heart that refuses to quit. If this story touched you, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Share it with somebody who needs hope today, and subscribe to join our community. May God bless you and your family, and keep you until the harvest comes.